Every season, we uncover stories of men and women whose names were nearly erased from the pages of history, people who endured chains, silencing, and struggle, yet still rose to become reminders of Allah's perfect will. These are not just stories about power or thrones. They are stories about resilience, faith, and what it means to survive in a world determined to forget you. This episode brings us to East Africa, to the life of a boy who began in bondage, but whose journey would take him to the highest seat of Egypt. His name was Kafur. His life is a testament that even when records are blurred and voices are silenced, the truth of one's presence can never be erased. Around the year 905 CE, in the lands of East Africa, a boy was born whose exact village and tribe have been lost to history. Some say he was Nubian, others suggest Abyssinian, but what is clear is that he came from a region that for centuries had been a crossroads of empires, trade, and struggle. His name was Kafur, and though the writers of his time never gave us a precise birthplace, they could not erase his presence from history. This absence of detail reminds us of something painful, that many who began their lives in bondage were not granted the dignity of a full record. Yet in Kafur's story, that silence becomes a kind of testament. He was East African, unmistakably African, and it was from those roots that he would rise from enslavement to the throne of Egypt. By the year 923, Kafur's life took the turn that would mark him forever in history. As a young boy, he was captured and sold into slavery, eventually purchased by Muhammad ibn Tugh al-Ikhshid, the future ruler of Egypt. Some later accounts add colorful details, saying he was bought from oil sellers for the price of 18 dinars, a gold coin used as money in the Islamic world at the time. Whether or not that exact detail is true, the meaning is clear. A human soul was reduced to a transaction. Adding to the cruelty, Kafur was made into what was called a eunuch, meaning he was forcibly castrated, so he could never marry or have children. In that society, men like him were considered more useful than women in certain roles, because rulers believed they could be trusted around royal women and had no families of their own to distract or divide their loyalties. What should have broken him did not. His intelligence, discipline, and quiet strength caught the eye of al-Ikhshad, who soon entrusted him with the education of his own sons. It was a rare acknowledgement, proof that even in bondage, Kafur's spirit carried the dignity of a leader waiting to be revealed. After Kafur was purchased, his life did not move straight into glory. His first duty was within the walls of the palace, where he was entrusted with teaching al-Ikhshad's sons. To many, this might have seemed like a small assignment, but for Kafur, it became the doorway to something greater. Each day he sat with the children of power, shaping their minds, but at the same time, he was shaping himself. He learned to read the silence of court life, to study the moods of rulers, to understand how discipline and wisdom could command respect even more than a sword. Though he carried the wounds of enslavement, the mark of being bought and altered, the loneliness of a man cut off from the family he would never have, Kafur refused to let bitterness harden him. Instead, he sharpened his spirit. His patience became his shield, his intelligence his weapon. The palace that once might have reminded him of his chains became the very place where those chains began to break. By the time years had passed, and his loyalty and brilliance could no longer be ignored, he was freed. No longer a slave, Kafur entered the world as a man of stature, ready to serve not only as a tutor, but as a commander. He stepped from the quiet chambers of the palace into the roar of the battlefield, carrying with him the lessons he had learned in silence. In the stillness of those years, he had been preparing, and in the eyes of many, it was becoming clear. The boy once sold was walking the slow path of destiny. When Muhammad ibn Tugh al-Ikhshid rose to power as ruler of Egypt, Syria, and the Hejaz, Kafur's own life began to unfold in ways no one could have imagined for a man who once stood on an auction block. No longer confined to the palace, he became a trusted companion at his master's side. On the battlefield, he rode not as a shadow, but as a commander, guiding men through the deserts of Syria and the sacred lands of the Hejaz. His presence carried weight, not because of his title, but because of his discipline, his fairness, and his refusal to let fear rule him. These years were the true test of his transformation. In every campaign, he proved his loyalty, not through empty words, but through action that safeguarded the dynasty and upheld the trust placed upon him. Soldiers who once may have doubted him, a dark-skinned foreigner who had begun as a slave, came to respect his judgment and follow his command. By the time a decade had passed, Kafur was no longer simply a freed servant elevated by fortune. He was recognized as one of al-Ikhshad's strongest pillars of power. He had risen from silence into authority, his life a testimony that dignity cannot be buried, even under the weight of chains. On July 24th, 946, al-Ikhshid, the man who had once purchased Kafur from the chains of slavery, died in Damascus. Power in the dynasty should have passed smoothly to his son, Unujur. But behind the throne stood a question: who would truly guide the empire? The boy was young, inexperienced, and surrounded by men hungry for influence. In that uncertain hour, it was Kafur, the once forgotten slave, who stepped forward. He did not seize the throne for himself, not yet. Instead, he became the guardian and regent, holding the reins of power while ruling in the boy's name. It was a role that demanded more than strength. It required balance, patience, and the steady hand of someone who understood both loyalty and survival. And Kafur had learned both the hard way. To the world, he still carried the marks of his beginnings: African, dark-skinned, and once enslaved. Yet to those in the court and to the soldiers in the field, he had proven that leadership is not always inherited. Sometimes it is earned in the fire of hardship. In that moment, Egypt's fate shifted. The boy who had been sold like a coin had now become the protector of an empire. For the next 15 years, Kafur ruled Egypt in the name of Unujur, al-Ikhshid's young son. Though the title of power belonged to another, the weight of governance rested on Kafur's shoulders. He managed the treasury, directed the armies, and negotiated with rival powers pressing in from all sides. The Fatimids to the west and the Hamdanids to the north eyed Egypt with hunger, but under Kafur's guidance, their advances were held at bay. What makes this chapter remarkable is not only his skill as a statesman, but the quiet way he wore authority. He did not rush to crown himself, though many must have whispered that he could. Instead, he chose patience, allowing his rule to grow naturally through trust and necessity. In the eyes of the people, it became clear. While Unujur was the figure on the throne, it was Kafur, once a boy stripped of freedom, who carried the empire's survival. When Unujur died in 961, many might have expected Kafur to take the throne for himself. He had the loyalty of the army, the respect of the court, and the experience to govern. But instead of seizing the crown, he stepped back once again, allowing Unujur's brother, Ala ibn al-Ikhshid, to rule in name. It was a deliberate choice, a show of restraint that revealed how deeply strategic he was. By letting the dynasty continue through the family line, Kafur preserved stability, silenced rivals who might accuse him of treachery, and strengthened his own legitimacy. Yet everyone knew where the true power rested. Kafur guided the armies, secured the borders, and managed the affairs of state, while Ali's name carried the royal seal. This ability to hold back, to rule without demanding titles, showed a wisdom far beyond ambition. Kafur understood that real authority does not need to announce itself. It proves itself in patience, in timing, and in the trust of those who depend on it. In 966, the long years of waiting reached their end. When ibn al-Ikhshid died, there was no longer a son of al-Ikhshid strong enough to sit on the throne. For 2 decades, Kafur had carried the burden of leadership in another man's name, first for Unujur, then for Allah, guarding the dynasty's honor while quietly holding Egypt together. He had proven his loyalty, his discipline, and his vision. Now, with both heirs gone, there was nothing left to conceal what everyone already knew. Kafur was the true ruler. For the first time, he allowed the empire to recognize him openly. No longer a guardian in the background, he took his place as sovereign in his own right. To the outside world, it seemed impossible. A man once sold into slavery, a man who had been castrated and dismissed as unworthy of legacy, now standing as master of Egypt, Syria, and the Hejaz. But to those who had watched him through the years, it felt inevitable. His patience had ripened into destiny, and the throne that once seemed out of reach now bore his name. When Kafur finally ruled in his own name, he did not waste the years of patience that had carried him to the throne. His reign was brief, but it was steady, defined by defense and wisdom. The Fatimids pressed from the west, the Hamdanids from the north, each hoping Egypt would fracture now that the dynasty had shifted. The Fatimids were a powerful Muslim dynasty that rose in North Africa during the early 900s. They followed the Ismaila branch of Shi'an Islam and claimed to be direct descendants of Fatima, the beloved daughter of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. This lineage gave them their name, Al-Fatimiyun, or the Fatimids. Their ambition reached far beyond ruling local territories. They sought to challenge the authority of the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, aiming to replace it with a Shia caliphate of their own. But Kafur held them all at bay, using diplomacy when words were sharper than swords, and steel when the borderlands demanded it. He protected the Nile Valley with the care of a man who knew what it was to be vulnerable, refusing to let the land he governed fall into the hands of rivals. Yet Kafur was not only a soldier king. He became known as a patron of learning and the arts, a ruler whose court attracted poets, scholars, and thinkers. Among them was the celebrated poet Al-Mutanab, who wrote verses under Kafur's shadow, sometimes in praise, sometimes in scorn, but whose very presence showed the magnetism of Kafur's rule. In these years, Egypt was not simply defended, it was cultivated. The boy who had been denied family and freedom gave back to the world through knowledge and culture, leaving traces of beauty alongside the memory of power. In April of 968, Kafur's extraordinary journey came to its end. After years of carrying an empire on his shoulders, the former slave, the patient regent, the castrated servant turned sovereign, breathed his last. He was laid to rest in Jerusalem, near the gate of the tribes on the Temple Mount, alongside the Ikhshidid emirs he had once served and then surpassed. His burial in such a sacred city was itself a testament. Egypt did not bury him as an outsider, but as a ruler whose name would endure. Within a year of his death, the Fatimids swept into Egypt and claimed the land he had protected. Yet his legacy was not erased. To this day, Kafur's life remains one of the most striking testimonies in history, that a man once sold for coins, stripped of family, and dismissed as unworthy could rise to sit upon the throne of Egypt. His story whispers a truth that cannot be ignored: that greatness is not determined by birth, but by endurance, patience, and the destiny written by Allah.